This episode of Trifles is brought to you by the BSI Press. Manuscripts, collections of papers by international writers, and books covering a wide range of other Sherlockian topics. Find them online at BakerStreetIrregulars.com. Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, the circle was red, the study was scarlet, and the Scot was glorious, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? Have you ever stopped to wonder about the giant rat of Sumatra, the remarkable worm unknown to science, or the repulsive story of the red leech?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 253, Meretricious Effects. Hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we look at some of the minutiae in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
Are you the meretricious Burt Wolder?
I am indeed the meretricious Burt Wolder. Absolutely. I mean, if this wonderful personality that I project requires a great deal of work. And if you go just a millimeter or so beneath the surface, you'll find there's nothing there.
Oh, come now. I'm sure there's something there, something that we'd be delighted to know. But we'll find out more right after these quick housekeeping notes. If you'd like to check out the notes for this show episode, they are available at ihose.co/trifles253. That'll bring you to the SherlockHolmesPodcast.com site, where you can find everything you need to know related to the show. You can listen to us right there. You can leave us a comment. You can also leave us a comment if you email us at trifles@ihearofsherlock.com, or find us on all of the socials as I Hear of Sherlock. And of course, we do appreciate your ongoing support on Patreon for as little as $1 a month. That allows us to keep plumbing the depths here. I don't know if we're still going to be able to have the fortitude to continue this in 2022. I mean, this is 5 seasons we're capping now. And it's, let's just say it's testing the degree of our own fortitude for what I would hope are some meretricious episodes.
Patience, as you do know, I know you know this, patience and fortitude are the names of the 2 lions in front of the New York Public Library main branch in Midtown Manhattan. And I think it's an interesting mix here. I mean, it's fortitude on our part and also on the part of our listeners to keep listening to all of this, and also patience. as occasionally we may introduce topics that, astonishingly enough, we don't wind up talking about.
This is feeling like that. Well, why don't we get right to it?
Yes.
Well, we mentioned meretricious effects, and this is inspired by our friend Vincent Wright from the illustrious clients of Indianapolis. He had an essay in 70 Years by Gaslamp, which is one of the illustrious clients' case books. This was published by our friends at Wessex Press. And, it was 2016, I think, 2018 is when this was published. So Vincent had an essay in this called Entirely Meretricious, with a question mark. And he said he was recently rereading The Crooked Man, and Holmes said to Watson, "These little sketches of yours are entirely meretricious." And that sent Vincent to the dictionary to ascertain exactly what it is that meretricious means. And he found two definitions. One, apparently attractive, but having in reality no value or integrity. And an alternative for that I found online is alluring by a show of flashy or vulgar attractions, tawdry. The second definition that Vincent found was of or relating to characteristic of a prostitute. And he quickly got it out of the way that Holmes did not mean that second definition of meretricious. But basically got into a wonderful essay talking about how Holmes was callous occasionally with his treatment of Watson's work. And let's face it, Watson's work is basically, as a PR man, as a front man for the Sherlock Holmes operations. He brings him more fame and hopefully fortune with these publications. But Vincent said he was tearing down Watson's work, demeaning it, stripping away the importance of his effort. He was less than impressed. And Vincent notes it wasn't the only time either. There are several times in the canon where Holmes gets in small jabs at Watson's writing, and other times when he got in big ones. So, Bert, I thought this could be an opportunity for us to explore some of those and see what it was that set Holmes off on these times where he was Watson's first and ultimate literary critic.
I love it. I absolutely love it for so many reasons. First of all, we've talked about this before, but it's very meta. You know, one of the reasons why the world of Sherlock Holmes and the relationship between these two people has lasted so long, and particularly if you look at it in comparison to other great mystery duos, Hercule Poirot and Captain Hastings, Agatha Christie, Dr. Thorndyke, Reggie Fortune. It's this sense of reality. You know, here is the narrator telling us that the fellow whose exploits he is reporting and conveying to the reading public isn't satisfied, in fact, doesn't think very much of it. And it has this ring of authenticity. So it's one reason why I love it. But the other reason is you and I are both in communications and public relations and marketing. And this is an old trope, you know, that the PR department is always looked down upon by the folks who are really running the company, the operations people, the IT people. Okay, fine. You can do your little blog posts here, boy. But at the end of the day, we know what's really important, and it's not you.
Well, interesting that you should say Meta, because that's exactly the corporate name that Facebook just gave itself, and dealing with its own PR problems, which one could argue this is not a PR problem. It's a business problem. Right?
Yes, that's exactly right.
So getting back to the business of Sherlock Holmes, I mean, here you have a brilliant consultant, an individual who has made the study of the history of crime and of methodologies, and has invented his own methodologies along the way to help him with his investigations. He's complaining about how he's presented to the public. And it starts, my gosh, very early on. You know, the first story that Watson brought to the public was A Study in Scarlet. And, of course, in the very next tale, in The Sign of Four, Holmes goes on the attack. And you know, Watson is clearly hungry for praise. You know, this massive work that he put out for a doctor who just came back from Afghanistan. He wants to be praised. He wants to please the subject of the story. And Holmes, he was obviously disappointed in Holmes's reply. Holmes said, "I glanced over it. Honestly, I cannot congratulate you on it. Detection is, or ought to be, an exact science, and should be treated in the same cold and unemotional manner. You've attempted to tinge it with romanticism, which produces the same effect as if you worked a love story or an elopement into the fifth proposition of Euclid." And Watson says, "Well, the romance was there. I couldn't tamper with the facts." And Holmes replies, "Some facts should be suppressed, or at least a just sense of proportion should be observed in treating them. The only point in the case which deserved mention was the curious analytical reasoning from effects to causes, by which I succeeded in unraveling it. So that's a pretty harsh, out-of-the-gate criticism on Watson's style. And you have to wonder, from Conan Doyle's perspective, what was the purpose in that conversation?
Oh, well, from the structure, from the standpoint of an author, if you want to presume that Conan Doyle wrote the Sherlock Holmes stories, it has the incredible ring of authenticity. And it must have been, I would think, an instance for Conan Doyle in which the characters he had created began to speak of their own accord. I don't think he sat down and said, I think I'm going to write a little interchange and it's going to be characteristic like this. I think he just sort of put his pen on the paper and thought about the scene in Baker Street and just to get started, what one would say to the other, and it popped out of their mouths.
Well, I think that's probably a good part of it. You've got this sense of conflict between our two heroes. A little friction, a little conflict is always entertaining. But at the same time, I think what you've also got there is a little bit of foreshadowing, right? Mm. Working romanticism into the fifth proposition of Euclid. Well, romance was at the heart of the Sign of Four, with Mary Morstan on the scene, walking into Baker Street in those early chapters. And then, of course, Watson walking out with her arm in arm, eventually to become Dr. and Mrs. Watson together.
Mm. Well, but the other thing too is that Conan Doyle, I think that's a great example, but Conan Doyle wanted to be considered. He worked. He had the strategy. He had the objective. He had the goal, the life goal of becoming an accepted literary participant in the literary world of England, not just someone who published cheap stories or sensational fiction, but someone who would be considered to be a serious novelist. And the lovely thing about this is that if anyone is going to be critical of the cases of this particular detective and these romantic things, he's getting a jump on you because he's having the character say, this romantic stuff is all very well and good, but it's not really what I'm doing. And the interesting thing too is, if you turn to Copper Beeches, that seems to me that's the best example of the more extensive and detailed deep dive into this, because Copper Beeches begins with Holmes' comment about, to the man who loves art for its own sake. It's frequently the lowest, less important, lowest things that the keenest pleasure is to be derived. Now, he never goes on to explain really what that means, so we can speculate on it, but he goes on to say, well, Watson, you have grasped that truth. And and he mentions, well, occasionally you embellish it, but you have given prominence not so much to the many cause célèbres and sensational trials in which I figured, but rather to those incidents which may have been trivial in themselves, but which have given room for me to demonstrate my skills, Well, now Watson is tickled by this, and he says, self-deprecatingly, I cannot quite hold myself absolved from the charge of sensationalism which has been urged against my record. Well, that sets Holmes off and says, you've erred in attempting to put color in life into each of your statements instead of confining yourself to placing the task, the task of placing upon record the reasoning and so on. Well, now that turns Watson off, and he says, well, I think I've done you full justice. And he says, I remarked with some coldness, for I was repelled by the egotism which I had more than once observed to be a strong factor in my friend's character. No, says Holmes, it's not selfishness. And there's Holmes answering his thought rather than his words. And then he goes on to say, crime is common, logic is rare, and you've degraded what should have been a course of lectures into a series of tales. Well, it's a magnificent little 3 or 4 paragraphs there, just taking out this idea, giving the characters voice to it, sort of setting the scene in Baker Street. And then, of course, off we go to Violet Hunter.
Yeah, and that was part of his complaint. There is that this degradation of his profession is bringing in governesses looking for lost lead pencils, and who should walk in but a governess?
Governess looking for a lost lead pencil,
which turned out to be one of the more fascinating cases that Holmes handled. When you think about it, he was ready to kind of put her off, and I think the Granada series has this smugness of Holmes, where he throws her note back to her, and it spins in the air and lands on the table, and he turns away, crosses one leg over the other, away from her, and puts his forehead in his hand. I mean, it's just a wonderful encapsulation of exactly what was going on, the mood at Baker Street that was set by his and Watson's disagreement.
Yeah.
So, well, we're going to take a quick break here, have a word from our sponsor, and we'll come back and talk about another instance of Watson's fatal flaw. In 2021, the BSI Press features 3 new volumes. That's right, 3 volumes, including one from the manuscript series, one from the profession series, and one dedicated to the outgoing head of the BSI. First, the manuscript series, you'll hear about the Staunton tragedy, that is, the missing 3/4. Mike Whalen, the former head of the BSI, has edited this book, in which a number of authors take aim at the missing 3/4. You'll learn about rugby, you'll learn about the mystery, you'll learn about, many things in the latest manuscript series. And in the latest profession series, Michael Quigley and Marcia Pollock edit this volume that brings together corporals, colonels, and commissionaires as they look at military in the canon. And the third volume is A Quiet Air of Mastery, essays in honor of Mike Whalen as he steps down as the head of the Baker Street Irregulars, and that's edited by Les Klinger. All of these and more are available at BakerStreetIrregulars.com under the BSI Press section. Be sure to pick up your copy today. And it's worth noting there that the third volume that we mentioned, A Quiet Air of Mastery, is probably more essential than ever right now because in between the recording of our last episode of I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere and this episode of Trifles, Mike Whalen sadly passed away. And we remember him over on IHearOfSherlock.com, but you might also want to remember him by picking up a copy of that book. Well, let's dig into our final example here of Holmes going off on Watson before we get to that ultimate conclusion that Holmes draws in one of his own cases. In the Abbey Grange, Holmes again tells Watson that there's much that he deplores about his narratives, and he specifically says, your fatal habit of looking at everything from the point of view of a story instead of as a scientific exercise has ruined what might have been an instructive and even classical series of demonstrations. You slur over work of the utmost finesse and delicacy in order to dwell upon sensational details which may excite, but cannot possibly instruct the reader. Now, I love this exchange because I think it clearly delineates the difference between Watson's approach to these tales and Holmes's approach. Watson's a storyteller. He wants to entertain. Holmes is a logician. He wants to teach, right? So Holmes, on the one hand, is trying to come up with a series of monographs, and Watson is trying to cater to the public's interest. Two very, very different audiences, but I think each one of them has a point.
Well, I think you're right, but I would also point out that in many of these conversations that Holmes has with Watson about the quality of his work, he speaks at cross purposes or doesn't support the larger criticism. So, there's much that Holmes has to say about Watson's work over the course of their long association. And none of it, I think, at the last analysis really supports the idea that it's meretricious. And in fact, Holmes can be equally positive and praiseworthy to Watson. At the same time, that's usually followed by a slap in the face of one sort or another. And there's one great example that is The Hound of the Baskervilles, which right at the beginning, Watson encounters Holmes sitting there in the Baker Street rooms looking at this walking stick. And he says, "What would you make of that, Watson?" And Watson gives him all, a set of conclusions. And Holmes says, "Watson, you excel yourself. I am bound to say that in all the accounts," now this is in The Hound, right? So there have been a substantial amount of accounts by this point, which you have been so good as to give of my own small achievements, says Holmes, that you've habitually underrated your own abilities. Well, now, of course, in another moment, Watson says, "My goodness, he'd never said this before, and I was just delighted, and I had been irritated by all of this criticism in the past. But now, then Holmes will go on to say, "Well, I'm afraid, Watson, when I said you stimulated me, I meant to be frank that in noting your fallacies, I was occasionally, not usually, but occasionally guided towards the truth."
Yeah, it's always with reluctance or in a backhanded way that Holmes manages to get around to complimenting Watson.
Yeah.
And I think it isn't until Holmes has to present his own stories. There's two instances of this, the Lion's Mane and the Blanched Soldier, where he realizes, look, if I'm going to put this down, pen to paper, and if a major publication wants to pick it up, it's not easy. It's not easy to create this narrative arc, to draw the audience in, to involve the dialogue and keep people strung along without revealing my thoughts. And he's very clear about this in The Blanched Soldier, where he knocks his hat off the hall table and is able to, in picking it up, is able to put his nose within a foot of the gloves that were left there. He says, "Yes, it was undoubtedly from them that the curious tarry odor was oozing. I passed on into the study with my case complete. Alas, that I should have to show my hand when I tell my own story. It was by concealing such links in the chain that Watson was enabled to produce his meretricious finales."
Well, hardly meretricious, but it's a lovely point, and I would say one more thing after this, but that when Holmes has to do this himself, he occasionally, let's say, falls short. And the other great example of that, of course, is in Lion's Mane, when Holmes, is taken on the role of Watson here and attempting to tell this. And what does Holmes do? There comes a wonderful scene in Lion's Mane where he must go see Maud Bellamy. And Holmes, winds up writing this almost Watsonian paean to Maud Bellamy. Who could have imagined so rare a flower would grow from such a root and in such an atmosphere? I could not look upon her perfect, clear-cut face with all the soft freshness of the downlands and her delicate coloring, without realizing that no young man would cross her path unscathed. Such was the girl who pushed open the door and stood now wide-eyed and intense in front of Harold Stackhurst. Oh.
Well, in the words of one Sherlock Holmes, cut out the poetry, Watson.
Well, now that's the other thing here, because we have to remember, after all, and that's a lovely cap to this, that who was writing most of this stuff? So as you're sitting there as Watson and Holmes is theoretically being so critical of you, you're the one who's jotting it down. Go a little more slowly, Watson. Holmes, I haven't quite caught that. Is it meretricious? Scribble. So he's the one who then turns around and as if to say, look what I have to put up with,
That's a great point. And you wonder if the two of them are in Baker Street working on this together. And he goes, oh, Holmes, that's good. More like that. Oh, well, the conflict works, and these two will forever be linked, both in their friendship and in their disagreements.
And that's much more than a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
You see, my dear Watson, it is not really difficult to construct a series of influences, each dependent upon its predecessor and each simple in itself. If after doing so one simply knocks out the central influences and presents one's audience with the starting point and the conclusion, one may produce a startling, though possibly a meretricious effect.